Number 5. David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz has been incarcerated at Attica Correctional Facility and later Sullivan Correctional Facility following his 1978 sentencing in New York State. He was held at Attica during portions of his incarceration, per New York Department of Corrections records. He called himself Son of Sam, and for over a year, that name paralyzed New York City. Between 1976 and 1977, David Berkowitz stalked the streets of New York, targeting young couples and women with dark hair. 6 people were killed, 7 more were wounded. The city descended into collective fear. Women dyed their hair blonde, couples stayed home. Nightlife in one of the world's most vibrant cities quietly collapsed. What made Berkowitz uniquely unsettling wasn't just the killings, it was the taunting. He wrote letters to NYPD Detective Jimmy Breslin and to newspapers, mocking investigators, referencing demons, claiming a neighbor's dog commanded him to kill. The letters were articulate, controlled, almost theatrical. The break came from a parking ticket, a mundane, bureaucratic slip of paper placed on a Ford Galaxy near the scene of his final attack, led detectives to Berkowitz's Yonkers apartment. When they found him sitting in the car outside his building, he looked up and said reportedly, "Well, you got me." No struggle, no drama, just resignation. At trial, Berkowitz pleaded guilty, avoiding a jury. He was sentenced to 365 years in prison, 6 consecutive 25-to-life terms. Psychiatrists documented a complex inner world of paranoid ideation, though his legal sanity was never formally disputed. In prison, Berkowitz underwent a religious conversion, becoming a born-again Christian. He has repeatedly waived his parole hearings, stating he doesn't deserve to be free. Whether that reflects genuine remorse or sophisticated self-preservation is a question his evaluators have never fully resolved. The unanswered question investigators still carry. Berkowitz later claimed he did not act alone, that the Son of Sam killings involved a satanic cult. He named names, the claims were investigated and officially dismissed, but at least one detective, retired NYPD investigator Jim Rothstein, went to his grave believing the cult angle was never properly closed.
Number 4. Mark David Chapman. Mark David Chapman has been held at Attica Correctional Facility since his 1981 sentencing and has appeared before the New York State Parole Board from Attica on multiple occasions, per official New York State parole records. On the night of December 8, 1980, Mark David Chapman shot John Lennon 4 times in the back outside the Dakota apartment building in Manhattan. Then, he sat down on the curb, opened a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, and waited for police to arrive. He did not run. Chapman had spent months fixated on Lennon, not with hatred initially, but with obsession. He idolized him. Then, something curdled. He became enraged at what he perceived as Lennon's hypocrisy, a man who sang Imagine with no possessions while living in luxury. In Chapman's fragmented internal logic, he wasn't killing a man, he was making a statement. He had traveled to New York weeks earlier with a gun, but turned back. He returned in December. On the afternoon of the murder, Lennon had actually stopped and signed an autograph for Chapman outside the Dakota. Hours later, Chapman fired. The psychological evaluation that followed was extensive. Chapman was diagnosed with a personality disorder with narcissistic features. He described himself as a nobody who wanted to become a somebody and believed killing one of the most famous men in the world would accomplish that. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, bypassing trial. He was sentenced to 20 years to life. Chapman has now been denied parole 13 times. At each hearing, Yoko Ono has submitted written opposition. The board's decisions have consistently cited the premeditated, public nature of the crime and the profound and ongoing harm to the victim's family and the wider public. The chilling documented detail, Chapman told a journalist that in the moments after the shooting, his only regret was that he hadn't gotten Lennon's autograph on the copy of The Catcher in the Rye he was carrying. So it would have been worth more.
Number 3. Joel Rifkin. Joel Rifkin is currently serving his sentence at Attica Correctional Facility, where he has been housed for portions of his incarceration following his 1994 conviction, per New York State Department of Corrections records. State troopers pulled over a pickup truck on the Southern State Parkway in June 1993 for a simple reason: no license plate. What they found in the truck bed would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in New York law enforcement history. Joel Rifkin had the body of a woman in the back. He didn't deny it. He told police her name was Susie. He said there were others. There were 17 others. Between 1989 and 1993, Rifkin had murdered 17 women, almost entirely sex workers, whom he targeted precisely because, as he later told investigators, he believed they would not be missed. He was largely correct. Many of the victims had gone missing without generating significant investigation. Some victims remained unidentified for years. Rifkin lived a double life with almost painful mundanity. He resided with his adoptive mother in East Meadow, Long Island, in a house he'd grown up in. He was quiet, socially isolated, and largely unremarkable to his neighbors. The garage attached to his home was where he committed many of the murders. His adoptive mother, Jean Rifkin, later stated she had no knowledge of what her son was doing. Investigators found no evidence to contradict this, though questions about what might have been visible lingered in the community. At trial, Rifkin was convicted and sentenced to 203 years in prison, a sentence structured to ensure he would die incarcerated. Psychiatrists noted he did not meet the legal threshold for insanity, despite documented social dysfunction and a reported compulsion he described as overwhelming. He has given multiple interviews from prison and has spoken about his crimes in clinical, detached terms that many investigators and victim advocates have found deeply unsettling. The verified, little-known fact: several of Rifkin's victims were identified only through DNA testing conducted years, in some cases over a decade, after his conviction. As of the time of his trial, at least 3 victims remained unidentified.
Number 2. Arthur Shawcross. Arthur Shawcross was incarcerated at multiple New York State correctional facilities, including Sullivan Correctional Facility, and later transferred within the New York State system. He died in 2008 while in the custody of the New York State Department of Corrections, having spent portions of his later incarceration at facilities including those in the Attica system, per state records. What makes Arthur Shawcross uniquely disturbing in the catalog of American violent crime is not just what he did, it is what the system knew and when it knew it. In 1972, Shawcross was convicted of manslaughter for the deaths of 2 children in Watertown, New York. He served 15 years, less than the maximum, and was paroled in 1987. Parole officers attempted to place him in several communities. Each time, locals discovered his history and forced him to relocate. He eventually settled in Rochester, New York. Between 1988 and 1990, he murdered 11 women, primarily sex workers in the Rochester area. The crimes went undetected for months as investigators struggled to connect disappearances into a coherent pattern. When the pattern finally emerged, aerial surveillance played a decisive role. A police helicopter spotted Shawcross standing on a bridge near the body of one of his victims. He was arrested. He confessed. At trial, the defense attempted a claim of extreme emotional disturbance, presenting psychiatric testimony about trauma Shawcross claimed to have experienced during the Vietnam War, testimony that was later substantially disputed. Military records did not support key elements of his account. He was convicted on 10 counts of murder and sentenced to 250 years. The Rochester community grappled for years with an uncomfortable public reckoning. A known, convicted child killer had been paroled, inadequately monitored, and had gone on to kill 11 more people. The officially unanswered question. Shawcross made claims in prison interviews about additional, unconfirmed victims in crimes in other states. Investigators took these statements seriously enough to open inquiries. None were formally substantiated during his lifetime, but none were definitively closed either.
Number 1. Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was incarcerated at Attica's predecessor institutions and within the New York State and federal correctional systems across multiple decades of the early 20th century. He was held at Sing Sing Prison in New York and various federal penitentiaries with documented New York State custody. Note, Panzram predates Attica's 1931 opening. He is included here in the historical context of New York State's most dangerous documented inmates of that era. There is no entry on this list, perhaps no entry in the history of American criminology, that reads quite like Carl Panzram. Because Carl Panzram wanted you to know exactly who he was. And he wrote it all down. Panzram was born in 1911 in Minnesota. By his own account, detailed in a handwritten autobiography he produced while incarcerated, later published as Killer, a Journal of Murder, he had been subjected to brutal abuse at reform school as a child, an experience he credited with systematically destroying whatever capacity for human connection he might otherwise have developed. He spent his adult life in an almost unbroken cycle of incarceration and violent crime across multiple continents. He confessed to 21 murders. He claimed to have committed crimes across the United States, Mexico, and West Africa. The full scope of his crimes was never formally verified, and investigators across multiple jurisdictions could neither fully confirm nor rule out the extent of his claims. What distinguished Panzram from nearly every other violent criminal of his era, or arguably any era, was his absolute refusal to perform remorse, rehabilitation, or humanity for any audience. He despised the court system, his jailers, and the public with equal and openly stated contempt. When a prison guard named Henry Lesser showed him basic human kindness and provided him paper to write on, Panzram produced one of the most raw and disturbing first-person documents in American criminal history. He was executed at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in 1930 for the murder of a prison laundry worker. A humanitarian group attempted to halt his execution. Panzram wrote to them directly, telling them to mind their own business and let him hang. At the gallows, when asked if he had any last words, Carl Panzram reportedly told the executioner to hurry up, that he had people to meet in hell. The chilling documented realization. Henry Lesser, the guard who gave Panzram paper and pencil, an act of basic decency that Panzram himself acknowledged, kept Panzram's manuscript for decades, unable to find a publisher willing to touch it. It was finally published in 1970, 40 years after Panzram's execution. Henry Lesser lived to see it in print. He said he never stopped thinking about what Panzram might have been had anyone shown him kindness before the damage was done.